Welcome to the 7th in the series of webinars on XMILE Big Data and System Dynamics. I'm Bob Eberlein from IC Systems, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce this webinar, the ALCES Toolkit, Regional Development and Land Use Dynamics. So today we're going to hear a presentation from Brad Stelfox, Matt Carlson, and Noah Purves-Smith of ALCES Landscape and Land Use Limited. This is the first time we've had 3 people presenting, and in a sense it's a metaphor for what they're doing, which is a little different from what we've seen so far. To date, we've seen some really fantastic use cases in system dynamics, but each of those use cases has been standalone where the modeling work was done and is done for presentation to people. Here we're going to see a case where a system dynamics model is being used in conjunction with other technology, a real marriage of different technologies and a way to show things to people different from showing a standard system dynamics models. And this is a really fantastic use case, and it's really what the promise of XMILE is, to allow the integration of system dynamics modeling with other applications and other technologies so that people can get the full experience. The promise of XMILE is to make this a lot easier. The presentation we're going to see today is from people who've had to work with tools that are a little bit prior to that, but it's a fantastic job. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. And so welcome. We'll start off with Brad and look so forward to seeing this presentation. Thank you. Brad?
This presentation describes the ALCES Landscape Simulator Toolkit, which has 3 basic components, including ALCES Integrator, which is a landscape simulator built into Stella simulation language, ALCES Mapper, which is an ArcInfo extension that allows us to spatially and explicitly assess alternative land use simulation scenarios, and a web-based tool called ALCES Online, which allows users a very quick and fast manner in which to explore the consequences of alternative land uses. The ALCES group has completed projects globally, including Australia, East Africa, India, South America, but most of its work has been in North America, and particularly Western North America, associated with the Great Western Sedimentary Basin and kind of geographically focused in Alberta. The key purpose of the ALCES simulation toolkits is to bring a broad diversity of stakeholders around a common table to explore both the consequences, benefits, and liabilities of alternative land use practices. And of course that means bringing people in from forestry, energy, agriculture, transportation, residential, including sociologists, climate change specialists, people representing First Nations, and economists. So a tremendous diversity of domains are represented in the ALCES simulation toolkit. To perform effectively, these models have to be able to track all meaningful and relevant overlapping land use practices, and they typically involve forestry, energy, mining, transportation, croplands including aquaculture, livestock, humans and their residential patterns, the land uses of First Nations or Aboriginal people, protected areas, tourism and recreation, the activities of hunting, fishing and trapping, and associated other industries. To work effectively, these models must also track all relevant natural disturbances, and these have to include climate and climate change, hydrology, natural disturbances like fire and insects, plant community dynamics, carbon pool dynamics, habitat dynamics of wildlife, and often population dynamics of wildlife. A key component is providing output on a broad suite of landscape metrics that are generated as the consequences of alternative land use scenarios. The typical way in which an ALCES project unfolds is by initially establishing a study area, in this case the province of Alberta in Western Canada. That study area is stratified into a series of landscape types, which generally represent different plant communities, and various footprint types. Those are the footprint types of the various land use practices. That information is imported into the ALCES simulator model, and the history of every land use is reconstructed, generally for the past century, but it could be a longer or shorter period of time. And that information is also put into the simulator. The natural disturbances are characterized, and they can change through time, so the amount, for example, of fire that we had 100 years ago may be different than what we have today, and that may be projected to be different in the future. Each and every land use practice has information in terms of desired future trajectories, and they can be several. They can operate at low, medium, or high tempo. And so the future trajectories of the various land use practices is entered into the simulator. The simulator conducts its simulations, generally using sensitivity analysis, and it generates a series of output, which includes tables and graphs, and then generates output that goes into ALCES Mapper and ALCES Online, generating a suite of map products. Let's look a little bit more at the ALCES integrator. As all Stella type models, there's a series of essentially spaghetti code connecting various components of the system. And in the case of ALCES, there are several 100,000 components. Obviously, that is not where we want our clients spending their time, so we've built a GUI, a graphic user interface, that is very logical and allows our clients to know where to go to put in information, how to conduct simulations, and how to see the output. So let's fire up a copy of ALCES to just demonstrate the general look and feel of the model. So this is one that's been customized for a specific region within the province of Alberta. There's buttons that are green that are navigational. You click on them and they take you to different components, different modules in ALCES. So here we have the module that deals with initializing your land base. If we click on it, it takes us to a module that allows us to enter information on the composition of the initial study area, classification of various landscape types into various sectors. Distributed throughout the model is a significant number of graphics to help the users understand the language and how information is brought in. So for example, clicking on stratification combinations takes you to this graphic, reminding you that you're tracking multiples of landscape types and serial stages or successional stages, various aquatic types, and the footprints, the land use footprints on top. So all of these various components are stacked on top of each other as a permutation. So footprints associated with aquatypes found in certain serial stages of landscape types. So if you put all of these together, you have several 100 million different combinations that are being tracked. Another key component of the ALCES model deals with climate. So one would click here to go to the climate module, and this is where you put in information dealing with meteorology, climate, and aquatics. And here's where you'd enter information on climate change, bringing in model input from general circulation models. Natural disturbance information is put here, and so you have a series of input tables dealing with historic, current, and future fire rates, for example, or anticipated changes in natural disturbances through time. There's some examples of the different natural disturbances that can be tracked in the ALCES model. Clicking on the land use sector takes you to panel 8, and here you get to see the overview of the various land use practices that are being tracked in ALCES. So for example, one could click on energy and put in information dealing with the hydrocarbon sector or temporal changes in drilling rates, or various metrics dealing with the footprints of the hydrocarbon sector, such as the size of pads or how many wells are on a pad, or the length of access roads to well sites, for example. And there's a variety of other examples, but probably time will not permit us to look at all of those. But to summarize this particular panel, this is where the information goes as inputs for each of the major land use practices. And here, each of these green boxes represent different panels that deal with information on spatial origin of footprints, conversion of landscape types, various inputs and outputs for commodity production, employment, and other economic metrics, the dynamics of social indicators. Here, the user can define a suite of best management practices that they wish to deploy on the landscape. And here, if you wish, not only can you track your indicators, but you can identify specific thresholds and make sure that the model does not violate those. A key component of the ALCES model is the control switch panel, which allows you to identify how much time or years is to be simulated in a range of natural variability. So before the arrival of industrial land use, how much time is involved in the backcast, so that's the period between RNV and where you are today, and how many years you wish to simulate into the future. And you have the ability to turn off and on individual natural disturbances or individual land use practices, so you can assess very quickly the performance or effect of one land use practice or its effect in combination with others. So to generally illustrate a simulation ALCES, we'll go to the control panel. In this case, we'll ask for all land use practices to occur. We're looking at a 50-year window of range of natural variability, a 150-year window of backcasting, and a 50-year window into the future. And the natural disturbances are wildfire, will turn insect outbreaks off, avalanches off, and meteorology on. We have entered all the various information on initializing our landscape, and we've already entered all of the information dealing with all of the various land use practices, and we could choose at this point to look at one metric. So for example, edge density. We can clear that particular page and ask the model to run. It's important to understand that when you're conducting a simulation in ALCES, all of the components are running and all of your indicators are being built. So as we, after the simulation is complete, navigate through the model, we will see the output for each and every one of the simulations. So the model has now completed its compilation. The simulation has begun. We've asked for a 250-year simulation. The first 50 years is going to be range of natural variability. The next 150 years will be the past 150 years in terms of the backcast of the study area. Year 200 will represent where we are today, and the time between 200 and 250 represents our future simulation. So we're getting to see how the landscape increases in the amount of edge over the last 150 years, where we are today, and the anticipated change of this particular metric into the future. But as it's simulating edge density, it's simulating another several thousand other indicators, as we will see once this simulation is complete. So we could exit out of here, and we could look at changes now in livestock populations through time. And in this particular study area, we're looking at populations of bison on this range of natural variability landscape, and elk, the loss of these species, the arrival of free-range cattle, their subsequent disappearance, the arrival of towns and settlements, and then a new population of cattle, regulated cattle, and then the reintroduction of elk. So as one example, we could then very quickly look at employment associated with various land use practices. So for example, here we can see the amount of employment associated with cropland and other land use practices in this study area. And then quickly shifting to plant community dynamics, we should be able to explore a broad suite of indicators dealing with plant communities. And one example here would be looking at the changes in the cereal stage and structure of various plant communities as influenced by the amount of fire on the landscape. So for those wishing to see output that isn't just tabular or graphic but expressed as maps, the simulator then has a network of export tables which are provided into ALCES Mapper, which is going to be discussed next and is used to generate maps.
Hello, it's my pleasure to be with you today to talk about Mapper. The role of Mapper is as a visualization and spatial analysis toolkit for ALCES outputs. Using Mapper, regional landscape dynamics can be allocated spatially to create plausible maps of future landscape composition and related indicators such as wildlife and ecosystem services. Mapping of scenario analysis outcomes is important because land use planning is a spatial process. Landscapes aren't uniform, but instead vary, sometimes substantially, over space in their ecological characteristics, their economic characteristics, such as natural resource potential, and land use rules, such as protected areas. Mapper allows this spatial variability to be incorporated, thereby providing more useful outputs for land use planning. Also important is that maps are typically more useful for communicating simulation outcomes than relying solely on graphs. Mapper exists as an ArcGIS extension with a wizard type environment which takes a user through the various steps for setting up Mapper for a study area and running the tool to create maps. The task at hand for Mapper during a run is the spatial allocation of 3 key drivers of landscape composition that ALCES is tracking at a regional scale. One is the growth and reclamation of human footprints such as roads, well sites, towns, and mines. Another driver is the conversion of land cover due to processes such as the expansion of farmland into natural habitat or climate change. A third key driver are natural disturbance events such as fire, which are an important consideration in many regions, including much of Canada. The next series of slides uses a simplification of human footprint tracking in ALCES and Mapper to convey how Mapper takes regional dynamics from ALCES and distributes them spatially to derive maps. There are many layers of complexity behind this, but at the core of it, ALCES simulates regional changes to the area of 15 footprint types by tracking the area of each footprint type that is built each year through footprint expansion, and the area that is reclaimed each year. So, for example, ALCES tracks how much infrastructure, such as wells, roads, and pipelines, must be built to achieve expected levels of oil production. This infrastructure has a finite lifespan, so ALCES also tracks the loss of footprint due to reclamation. During the course of a simulation, the area of each footprint type is the balance between construction and reclamation. The example shown here is human footprint in the province of Alberta over the next 50 years. Footprint construction is expected to outpace footprint reclamation, such that the amount of footprint in the province doubles. The increase in human footprint is not expected to be uniform, and Mapper's task is to take regional footprint dynamics from ALCES and distribute them spatially in a realistic manner. So, for example, growth of footprint associated with oil production is expected to be high in northeastern Alberta due to oil sands development. Footprint growth in the Calgary to Edmonton corridor in south central Alberta is also expected to be high due to the expansion of cities and surrounding rural residential. Other areas, such as north central Alberta, may actually see a decrease in footprint because few, if any, new resource developments are expected. Mapper achieves this spatial representation of footprint dynamics by applying rules to spatially allocate footprint growth and reclamation on an annual basis. So, in a simulation year, ALCES may call for the construction of a number of new oil wells. One type of information the Mapper uses to distribute the oil wells across a province is maps of the relative likelihood of the footprint occurring. Here we have the relative likelihood of conventional development in the left map and oil sands development on the right. The maps are based on the spatial distribution of oil reserves in the province. As the simulation proceeds and conventional oil reserves are depleted, Mapper uses these maps to represent a northward shift of oil development towards the oil sands deposit. Another type of information used by Mapper are distributions that convey how the intensity of a footprint type should vary across landscape cells. Yet another type of information used to spatially allocate footprint construction are user-defined growth patterns, such as the aggregated pattern in the top row of images or the sporadic pattern in the bottom row of images. Now moving on to footprint reclamation. Spatial allocation of footprint reclamation in Mapper is typically done based on spatial variation in the age of the footprint types. Because Mapper is tracking the age of footprint across the study area, it can use the information to reclaim older footprints first. So, by spatially allocating footprint construction and reclamation, Mapper is able to derive maps of future footprint distribution that are consistent with ALCES outputs. Similar processes are used to spatially allocate the conversion of natural land cover, as well as the occurrence of natural disturbance events such as fire. The resulting maps of future landscape composition can then be used to create maps for indicators like wildlife or ecosystem services. As an example, this next series of maps shows the increase in risk to woodland caribou as natural resource development spreads northwards in Canada's western boreal forest in Alberta. We start in the year 1950 and have 60 years of backcast, with the red colors showing higher risk to caribou and the green colors showing lower risk. As we move towards present day, we see an increase in risk, and that trend continues in the 50 years of the forecast part of the simulation. I'll now pass the presentation on to Noah, who will discuss the ALCES Online tool.
Hello, my name is Noah Purves-Smith, and today I have the pleasure of introducing you to the ALCES Online tool. So we've heard from Brad, and he's introduced the ALCES simulator and how we're using the ALCES simulator to model and track all kinds of land use and landscape indicators and variables. And that data has been passed to Matt, who's introduced you to the ALCES Mapper tool, which is used to take that data from ALCES and prepare it for spatial presentation. Now, ALCES Online is the final tool in the toolkit, and it's really intended to be an end-user tool with the goal of making a dynamic, engaging, and very fast and responsive environment for the end users, whether that would be a planner or a scientist or a modeler or a stakeholder, to take that data and explore it, look at different relationships, and have a better understanding of what's happening on their landscape. So what kind of data are we talking about? Well, we're tracking over 300 variables in ALCES and ALCES Mapper, which have been passed to ALCES Online. We've got 27,000 grid cells at a 5 by 5 kilometer resolution, and when we scale that to a 2.5 kilometer resolution, we've got 108,000 grid cells. We've built 25 different future scenarios that use different assumptions of how the land is being managed, and we've got a whole bunch of different time slices. So we've backcast the data to sort of recreate the history, and we've also forecast it to the future under those different scenarios. So we're talking about a lot of data points and just an incredible volume of data. And one of the most important pieces here is we talked about wanting to have it dynamic, engaging, and fast. So what does fast mean? So we need the results to be filtered by specific variables and regions so that it's meaningful for that end user. We, in addition to that, want to be able to perform advanced calculations and further explore those data relationships so the users can actually create new equations and formulas, and all this has to happen in real time. And by real time, our goals were to be able to deliver map results and charts to the user within sort of 5 to 10 seconds for a basic indicator. So we really put some high demands on the system, and here's what we come up with. So let's go into ALCES Online and take a look at it. So the first tool I'm going to open up is the mapping tool. And for those of you who are outside of Alberta, I'm going to go to this lower Athabasca region, which, if you've heard of the Alberta oil sands, this is the region where all that activity is taking place. So might be an interesting region to look at. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look in here, I'm going to choose an existing indicator, and as I said, we've got hundreds of different indicators ranging from air indicators, commodity, ecological, economic, forest, all kinds of different indicators. What I'm going to put in here just for a demonstration is I'm going to look at the total footprint. So this is all of the sort of the anthropogenic human-made footprint in that area. And we've got the choice to choose these different growth scenarios. And on top of that, we can choose whether we want to look at it in a variety of different sort of map styles. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. And we're going to look at what does the total footprint look like for that region. So here we've got, we start at pre-industrial, and then we go from 1910 and we go into the future. Right now the map is started at 2010, but I can play that into the future and we can see the map changing as we go towards 2060. and I'll loop that around to the past also. So there's the pre-industrial. I'll speed it up a little bit, and we'll look at from 1910 up to the present. So that's our basic map. We've also got a different base layers, so we can look at a terrain-based map. We can look at a satellite map. Of course, we can pan around and zoom just like other web mapping tools like Google Earth. One of the other interesting base maps is the night map, and what's interesting here is we really find a pretty strong correlation between the results that are coming out of ALCES and Mapper and where the human footprint is, how that relates to actually light sky emissions. So I'm going to actually leave this on a terrain map, and I'm going to show you another type of indicator, and that is Create Basic. So what Create Basic is it allows the end user to go and look at some indicators that might have different relationships than just the canned ones we have in there. So for example, let's say there's a biologist wants to look at a critter that lives in the forest and is sensitive to edge. So I'm going to look up forest and say, okay, I want to see where there's forest, and since my critter needs forest, I'm going to be looking for lots of forest, and I'm going to say that's quite important. And I'm going to look up edge. So edge being linear features created by man-made footprints. And I'm going to say that this creature actually doesn't really like edge, so we're going to look for areas with low edge, and I'm also going to weight that about the same. And I can now go and run this, and it's got some sort of pre-made algorithms that's going to go and try and take those relative weightings and favored values and return a result for the client based on that. So the end user doesn't need to know a lot of statistics and math to be able to go and look and make meaningful indicators for themselves. On top of that, there is the ability for those that are the more mathematically inclined and the more advanced users. You can we've created the ability to create any kind of equation you'd like to. So I could make the same equation, and I could add in say put a coefficient of some kind in for that indicator, and we can keep building that. I'm not going to go through and demo that one right now for time's sake, but we have some really sophisticated stuff in here. We can put as many different terms as you want in the equation. We can put in temporal values, so we can say, well, we know this value's changed over time. We can say, well, this value is actually related to another one, and have it changing accordingly. So that's a little bit of the advanced calculator. One other thing I'll show you on the map is we've got all of these different current footprint features on there, so I can go and see where are the pipelines right now and the roads, and we can load these current footprints and fade them on and off the map. So that's really important also for the end users, because it brings it sort of validates the data. They look and see, okay, well, the map's showing me that there's footprint there, and when I go and look at it on the satellite, and when I go and look at those current footprint maps, that's actually what's happening there. So it helps give some trust in the model. Now, we also have created the ability to go and save those simulations and to chart them. So for example, I could look at the total footprint one, and I'm going to actually load that onto a chart. And maybe so this one is with moderate management practices, and I actually went and ran another one with just the business as usual management practices. So I can go and chart things and compare them compare different simulations against themselves. And the one final tool I'm going to show you is the scatter plot, and this is a really interesting tool because the scatter plot is a neat way of being able to explore different relationships happening between different variables in the system. So I'm going to go and look at a sub-region again. This time I'm going to look in the southern part of the province, so the South Saskatchewan rivershed. And let's say I want to look at the difference between, I want to see if there's any relationship between water quality and how that's affected by centers with lots of human population, or maybe how it's affected by agricultural production. So let's go and see if there's any kind of relationship there. So I'm going to generate a scatter plot here. And there we go. There's a 3D scatter plot showing us. And there may or may not be a relationship there, but we can zoom in and out and explore these different values. And so that's a really helpful tool for scientists and planners that are trying to understand what's happening on the landscape and look at different relationships that may not already be clearly established. So this is helping look for different trends and relationships. And that's in a 10-minute summary. That's ALCES Online for you. So I hope it's been an informative and interesting presentation, and I'd like to especially thank IC Systems for hosting us. Thank you.
So the first question we have here is, how technically closed is ALCES? Could I link it with FOSS tools, for example?
Matt, do you want to try and tackle that question?
I apologize, but I'm not sure what is being referred to by FOSS tools.
I don't either, but I think they're talking just in general. They have some other tool set out there that they want to link it to. Oh, free and open source software, it says.
Oh, free and open source software. Well, I mean, I guess what we're doing here is taking output from one model and then applying new rule sets to it to make it work in another model that has different functionalities. So, for example, in ALCES we have regional landscape dynamics being simulated, and we apply different rule sets to that output to make it spatial. But you could apply the same type of approach, but to different tools to make outputs from something like ALCES functional in some other model. So I think the flexibility is there to achieve that.
You know, an example might be some work we're doing with CSIRO in Australia, and they, through Beth Fulton's shop, have some wonderful marine models looking at the effects of different harvest strategies on fish communities and fish populations. So we're using the ALCES model to track those coastal landscapes and the effects of agriculture and other land uses on water quality. We're also tracking the fishing fleets. So the output from ALCES model then becomes an input to a variety of different models that CSIRO have built, some more tactical, some more strategic. And so it's just a matter of agreeing on what are the conventions for units and DTs, and so we can, all the data that comes out of these models can be exported and brought into other models as long as there's a conversation about appropriate formatting.
Great, thank you. And so a related question was, if the platform is being used in other applications, for example, wide area disaster recovery, contingency planning for disaster response, or anything like that?
Well, that's a good question. One of the things that we're setting the model up right now in the province of Alberta, but it could be done for any other areas, is by tracking the suite of land uses. So looking at pipelines, looking at roads, even looking at vehicular activity on roads, the amount of traffic, factoring in slope aspect, relief, fires. We can very quickly build surface responses that look at the relative probability and magnitude of events, whether they be floods or fires or accidents. So as long as people feel that disaster type events that are not fully stochastic like earthquakes, but ones that involve people moving through landscapes and pipelines and industrial features, as long as they feel that those things are favorable inputs for defining those relationships, the model very effectively builds those let's call them risk maps.
Great, thank you. And people are wondering how much of the SD model is specific to Alberta, how much is generic, and how much can be modified?
Another good question. The model we built generically, it's a global model. We've deployed it on about 4 continents. The key domain elements, the very basic architecture, that there is land use, that the landscapes need to be stratified into different types, that there is a hydrological cycle, that there can be natural disturbances. Those things are all globalized, and then the coefficients that define the behavior of each of those land uses or natural disturbances, of course, are entered into the model for the specific region. So we're doing some work in a fairly arid place in India. ALCES is working very fine. Of course, the coefficients that are in the model are radically different than Alberta. The same for the work we're doing in Australia. Or Matt did some previous work in Paraguay, and the model worked fine there. Of course, you have to put in relevant coefficients to that part of the world.
Great. Some people have asked whether they can get access to the model itself, the system dynamics model.
Yeah, the ALCES as a model exists, and it's commercial software. It's available to be purchased by commercial users. It's also available to be used free in the educational arena. And so we have had multiple copies used in secondary and post-secondary institutions globally. For people, for example, consultancies that want to use it, they can acquire it on a one-off basis. And as Noah showed us with ALCES Online, that's a very recent application we built, and we're serving that out on a subscription basis, Karim.
Great, thank you. And people are asking, let's see, can you talk a little about the transportation infrastructure module in ALCES? Specifically, is it able to simulate future changes in transportation infrastructure for a region?
Yes, most certainly, and that's a key element of ALCES, is in terms of transportation, it's building your roads, whether it be your major arteries, highway arteries, your secondary roads that are going to things like well sites to extract hydrocarbons or cut blocks to extract wood, or minor roads going to acreages for, say, rural residential. So these features are built, and they can have a lifespan in terms of road networks. For the most part, they're permanent, but in some cases, such as roads going to well sites, they have a defined lifespan and they need to reclaim. In addition to building the roads themselves, ALCES builds the transportation mode on top of it, which could be cars or lorries or motorcycles, or a transportation network could be a pathway through a park, and that path has a certain number of hikers that are on top of it. So it builds the features. It uses algorithms that link, I guess, the point at which a resource is being extracted or a resource exists to the existing road network using engineering algorithms. And so one can choose to adopt greater or lesser levels of complexity in terms of building roads, and that reflects itself in the simulation time.
Great, thank you. And I don't know if it came across clearly earlier. There were some stutters in the sound, but ALCES Online does in fact show you changing land uses from the past into the future so that you can see what's going on or what might happen. There's a question about what are the price points for subscriptions, or is there a web page they can go to for budgeting purposes?
Good question. One can go to our website of www.alces.ca. The ALCES Online tool that Noah demonstrated is essentially brand new. We're just releasing it right now, and so our website needs to change and will change in the next few weeks to reflect that. I would recommend that anyone just contact me, Brad Stelfox, and I can talk to you about what kind of complexity of subscription you need, and depending on, I guess, the spectrum from education to ENGO to full industry reflects itself in terms of the costs. But it's a subscription cost. Right now we're serving it out at $30,000 a year for the entire province of Alberta. Of course, this approach can be adopted in any other geography in the world as long as we have access to the input data. So there is no one hard answer to that good question right now. It's just a matter of having a conversation with the ALCES group and understanding what the needs of the clients are.
Great. Someone asked earlier if the footprint types must be really small polygons. That's their guess. And do you run the simulation for even tinier spatially explicit raster zones?
You know, I'm going to pass that question either on to Matt or Noah. I think they'd probably provide a better answer to that question because it's a good question and it's got a fairly complex answer.
Sure, I can answer that briefly. In terms of the resolution of the analysis, I mean, Mapper is a cell-based model in terms of how it represents space. So it's dividing a region such as the province of Alberta into thousands of cells and then tracking the composition of each of those cells in terms of the proportion of it that is covered by each of a variety of types of natural and anthropogenic land cover types. And when we're analyzing smaller study areas, then we can use much smaller cell sizes. So we could use, it's user defined, so the cell could be as small as you'd like, but the one constraint is that the more cells you have, the slower the model runs become. So we typically try to keep the number of cells below 200,000. And then in terms of the size of the feature itself, when we're parameterizing either Mapper or excuse me, ALCES, we start with spatially explicit data, which shows the location of polygons of each footprint type. And so those polygons can be of whatever size. And then that information is incorporated and used in the simulations.
From a modeling perspective, Brad, what were the main challenges to establish the equations that reflect the relationships between societal changes and their impact on nature variables?
Yeah, real good question. So, you know, everyone's after triple bottom line and modeling tools that help people understand, you know, both the benefits and liabilities. So always we're reporting out on ecological indicators. With a lot of our stakeholders, federal governments, provincial governments, or industry, they look very carefully at these equations. One can imagine that as ecologists we don't have, let's say, high rigor or high power with respect to our knowledge data sets in every small area. For example, Noah was showing the lower Athabasca, and there's a tremendous amount of data, say, known on caribou in general in western North America, less known in Alberta, less known in northeast Alberta. So one ends up acquiring coefficients that are the best available. And that can be primary literature, that can be through a Delphi process, that can be a wild-ass guess. You know, it can be that whole spectrum. And so we find that as we report out on how ecological indicators respond to increasingly industrial landscapes, that a lot of our stakeholders would prefer there to be local empirical data that's driving the models. And in some cases that's quite possible. In other cases it's not, and you either choose not to simulate the indicator or you acquire coefficients and response surfaces from the broad literature. And not everyone is equally comfortable. Alberta seems to be a place where they want to, you know, invent their equations and their coefficients for all indicators, and we're decades away from having that. So in some cases we have no choice but to draw on the literature for those response surfaces.
Thank you. How does ALCES manage the very large number of parameters implied by the degree of disaggregation?
Well, that's a key question, is like for all of us as modelers. If we're talking about the ALCES simulator, it's got maybe 200 variables that are all arrays. Most of those variables have arrays that vary between 10 and 40. And as we conduct projects, we sit down with the stakeholders to strike a balance in terms of the trade-off between the number of arrays or disaggregation of these systems and the comfort or knowledge level of data that we have that can populate these models. So we've done probably 200 projects so far. We think we've found a level of disaggregation for a strategic level model. So let's realize quite quickly that ALCES is broad, exceptionally fast, and exceptionally strategic. Our goal is not to disaggregate the system any more than required, because as we do that, we lose power or predictive ability, and the embedded uncertainty in the outcomes are greater. So two key drivers or vectors of uncertainty is one, the level of disaggregation, and secondly, how far we simulate into the future, because we're of course compounding probability errors and functional errors in terms of industries knowing what they'll do in the future. So ALCES is confronted by the same types of challenges with disaggregation of any system dynamics model. It's an ongoing challenge and should be a challenge too.
What is the back-end technology for the mapping? Is it so people are wondering if it's ArcGIS Online or something else?
Probably two separate questions. Maybe Matt, if you could quickly talk about the mapper side and then turn it to Noah for the online side.
Sure. So yeah, so Mapper exists as an ArcGIS extension. And so the key tasks are taking spatially explicit data in terms of the current landscape composition and converting that into cell-based data. And that information then exists as database. And really what Mapper does then is plays around with the database to reflect the simulated changes through time. But the environment that the user uses to access Mapper and run it is ArcGIS. And then Noah?
And then when it comes to the online side of things, then we actually found for our speed requirements and the need to make it return results as instantly as possible and at the same time be flexible enough to calculate indicators against each other, we found that the ArcGIS platform couldn't perform what we needed it to, so we actually built our own proprietary WebGIS system that's spitting all this data out. And for reference, actually the location I'm at today, I've got fairly poor internet, and I was worried I wouldn't be able to join the webinar, but I did a speed test, and my download speed is about 1 megabit right now, which is pretty marginal. And it was taking sort of 30 seconds or something to get these maps. If you're in an office with a good internet connection, you can expect to see them coming in basically in 5 to 10 seconds. And once you have it, it's basically instant to between years. We found we couldn't get that kind of performance with the ArcGIS.
Great, thank you. What is this? I'll only take two more questions. So the second to the last question is, what is the data accuracy, and is there any way to validate the final results, for example, against stakeholders and their expectations?
Yeah, that's a good question, and if Noah is able to, and I think he showed us where he was putting some overlays over top of satellite imagery. So the entire scenario starts in a GIS and ends in a GIS. And as Matt indicated, on the simulation side, we're reporting out on cells. So people frequently want to know whether there's any concordance between the heat maps that show density of commodity production or road density or habitat quality for indicators. And so you can very quickly zoom in, as Noah's doing right now, and look at the heat map. You can overlay the actual raster or vector data and show where the pipelines are. And it becomes a very effective way at showing people that the model does know where the features are today. Now, the moment you start simulating into the future, that the probability of the model being right, of course, is 0. We're splitting the feature to explore alternative scenarios, not to know the future in a predictive sense. So the model builds features, and people can quickly look at their distribution, their contagion, and see if their geographic patterning is similar to maybe what we observe today, which is our reference point. So allowing people to zoom in, as Noah's doing right now, and see where the map shows these features are relative to, could be Google imagery or anything else, is a very important way of convincing our stakeholders that the model has a level of accuracy that's acceptable. Like any models, as Matt said, we're starting with input of GIS data. If that data is exceptionally coarse or inaccurate, then the model will propagate those errors throughout the entire system. So there's always an important conversation about resolution and accuracy and vintage of data.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you, Matt and Noah, also for your presentation today. My last question is, there are actually a lot of questions about the availability of ALCES for in Africa, in Europe, in Spain, in the U.S., in Florida. Do you have any plans for these areas, or are there examples already in some of these areas? I know you showed the map at the beginning.
Well, obviously, we're Alberta boys initially, so we've focused on Alberta. Matt lived in Alberta for many years before moving to Ottawa. Because of ALCES and what it's done in Alberta, we now have clients that are asking us, and we're working with them to populate versions for Manitoba, Saskatchewan, BC. We're involved in a project for populating one in India, one in Australia, and so we're prepared to work with any collaborators. The model will work any place on Earth as long as it has access to GIS data and access to comment about land uses and natural disturbance regimes. So one of the reasons we built this Karim is to have the opportunity to work with some with collaborators and try the model out in other geographies. So we're wide open to any conversation along that direction.
I would like to join all of us in thanking you guys for a fantastic presentation and really great question and answer session. That was excellent. We have a April 8th webinar that's to be determined. We haven't quite settled on that yet, but we'll be announcing that fairly shortly. We will be following up this webinar with a list of, just to remind you where you can find it on the YouTube channel, and a list of the upcoming webinars. And then to sort of cap off the webinar series, we're going to have a series of 4 webinars that are really focused on the nature of XMILE and what we're going to be using it for. One of them is introduction, and then we're going to talk a little bit more technically about simulation and display capabilities, and then we're going to cap that off with a panel discussion where we bring in some of the people who've presented in the different webinars to talk about the use of XMILE, where we can have it used, and how it might be going forward. And that's sort of as in preparation for the Summer System Dynamics Conference, where we're also hoping to be able to present some work on XMILE. So thank you all for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the webinar, and we look forward to seeing more of these in the future.